I arrived in Berlin on August 12, 1961, just 24 hours before the first barbed wire would slice the city in half. The air was thick with tension, every citizen seeming to sense the approaching catastrophe. My cover was simple enough: cultural attaché with the American mission, one of many diplomatic faces in a city teeming with spies. The real purpose of my deployment was to monitor Soviet military movements around the Brandenburg Gate, but none of our intelligence had prepared us for what was actually brewing beneath the streets of Berlin. The city itself felt wrong somehow, as if the very stones were holding their breath. The morning fog hung unnaturally still around the bomb-damaged buildings, refusing to burn away even under the summer sun. My handler, a veteran named Thompson, who'd been in Berlin since '45, met me at Tempelhof Airport with a warning that seemed odd at the time. "The Russians aren't the only thing watching us here," he said, his eyes darting to the shadows between buildings. "This city remembers things it shouldn't." Our team was small but carefully chosen. James Harrison, a British signals expert who'd cut his teeth intercepting Soviet communications during the blockade, managed our surveillance equipment. His expertise went beyond normal military training. He'd been part of a classified program studying anomalous radio frequencies emanating from certain parts of the city. The patterns he'd detected seemed to defy the laws of physics, appearing simultaneously at multiple locations, or preceding the events they described. Our German translator, Dieter Weber, had deeper connections to the city than he initially revealed. His father had been involved in some highly classified Nazi research program, and though Dieter never spoke directly about it, his knowledge of Berlin's underground structures proved invaluable. He knew of tunnels and bunkers that appeared on no official maps, and more importantly, he knew which ones to avoid. The way he would sometimes freeze at certain intersections, refusing to proceed without performing what he called necessary precautions, should have been our first warning that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than Soviet expansion. The disappearances began almost immediately after my arrival. At first they seemed connected to the rising tensions, people vanishing before they could be caught by one side or the other. But there was something wrong about the pattern. Witnesses reported seeing the same person in multiple locations simultaneously, or watching someone walk through a solid wall as if it were air. Most disturbing were the cases where someone would return home to find another version of themselves already there, both iterations claiming to be the original. The Soviet authorities were clearly aware of these incidents. Their response teams would arrive with unusual equipment that looked more suited to scientific research than military operations. Through our surveillance, we observed them taking readings with devices that made Harrison's instruments malfunction. Whatever they were measuring, it wasn't radiation or conventional energy signatures. The readings seemed strongest in the no-man's land between east and west, particularly around areas that had sustained heavy damage during the war. Our first direct encounter with the phenomenon came during a routine surveillance operation near the Brandenburg Gate. We had set up our equipment in an abandoned building, monitoring Soviet troop movements as they began the preparations for what would soon become the Berlin Wall. Harrison's equipment started picking up what he called echo signals, radio transmissions that seemed to be coming from alternate versions of our own surveillance operation. Through the headphones, we could hear our own voices discussing events that hadn't happened yet, or making different decisions at crucial moments. The recordings, when we managed to make them, would change between playbacks, as if the past itself was becoming unstable. Dieter became increasingly agitated as the anomalies intensified, muttering about his father's research and something called Project Spiegelmann, the Mirror Man. He began drawing complex geometric patterns on the floors and walls of our observation posts, claiming they would keep the reflections aligned. At the time, we dismissed it as psychological stress, but after what we witnessed in the coming days, I wish we had paid more attention to his warnings. The Soviet response to these anomalies revealed that they had been dealing with similar phenomena for years. Through our surveillance, we observed them establishing a peculiar type of perimeter around certain areas of the city. Their soldiers would work in pairs, never letting their partner out of sight, and they carried mirrors mounted on their rifles, not for seeing around corners, as we initially assumed, but for confirming their own reflections. Most telling were the reports we intercepted about their scientific research in East Berlin. They had set up laboratories in old Nazi bunkers, continuing experiments that had been started during the war. The documents we managed to obtain spoke of reality stabilization protocols and identity coherence maintenance. But it was the photographs accompanying these reports that truly chilled us. Images of people who appeared to be splitting into multiple versions of themselves, each one slightly different, as if reality itself couldn't decide which version was real. The Soviets weren't just building a wall to prevent escape. They were trying to contain something that had been unleashed in the dying days of the Third Reich, something that had waited patiently in the shadows of the ruined city for the perfect moment to emerge. The construction of the Berlin Wall commenced at midnight on August 13th, and with it came a surge in the anomalies we'd been tracking. The initial barrier of barbed wire seemed to follow paths that made no strategic sense, until we overlaid them with Dieter's old maps of the city's occult architecture. The Soviets were following patterns established centuries before, creating boundaries that served purposes beyond simple division. Our intelligence suggested that they were embedding strange devices within the foundation of the wall, not just listening posts and sensors, but pieces of equipment that pulsed with an energy our instruments couldn't identify. Harrison's attempts to analyze these devices led to increasingly bizarre results. Photographs would show different configurations each time they were developed, and audio recordings captured voices discussing events that hadn't happened yet. Most disturbing were the readings that suggested parts of the wall existed in multiple locations simultaneously, or that the space on either side somehow contained more distance than it should. The mathematical impossibility of these measurements drove Harrison to the edge of a breakdown, especially after he began encountering other versions of himself during routine operations, each one claiming to be the original, each one remembering slightly different versions of events. Dieter's knowledge became increasingly crucial as the situation deteriorated. His father's research, it turned out, had been part of a Nazi program attempting to exploit weaknesses in what they called the membrane of reality. They had discovered that certain locations in Berlin, particularly those with a history of violence or significant historical events, were susceptible to manipulation. The Nazi scientists had attempted to use these points to create weapons, portals that could bypass conventional defenses, or ways to infiltrate Allied positions by sending soldiers through what they called mirror spaces. But their experiments had cracked something fundamental in the structure of reality around Berlin. The Soviets had discovered these fractures, and rather than trying to repair them, had been attempting to stabilize and control them. The wall wasn't just for keeping people in or out. It was being designed to contain whatever had begun seeping through these cracks in reality. Dieter's increasingly erratic behavior suggested he knew more than he was telling. He would spend hours checking his reflection in different mirrors, comparing tiny details as if searching for discrepancies. The way he would sometimes stare at his hands, flexing them as if unsure they would respond correctly, spoke of a deep uncertainty about his own identity. The most terrifying aspect of these events was the way they began to affect our perceptions of reality itself. Simple actions like walking down a street became exercises in uncertainty. Had we taken this path before? Or was this a version of the street from another reality? People we interviewed would have completely different memories of events we had personally witnessed, and documents we had read would contain different information each time we reviewed them. The boundary between East and West Berlin began to feel less like a political division and more like a surgical incision, an attempt to isolate something that had been spreading through the fabric of the city itself. Our observations revealed that the Soviets were not just building a wall, they were constructing a kind of containment system, using the political situation as cover for a much more esoteric purpose. The physical barrier was being augmented with devices that Harrison's equipment couldn't properly register, creating what Dieter called reality anchors at regular intervals. These devices seemed to stabilize the fractures in local space-time, but at a cost. The areas around them became zones of impossible physics, where the normal rules of cause and effect began to break down. We documented cases of people aging decades in minutes, or reverting to childhood, of buildings that would appear modern from one angle and war-damaged from another, and of reflections that would continue moving after their owners had stopped. Through our surveillance operations, we managed to intercept fragments of Soviet research documents that painted a disturbing picture of what they were dealing with. The Nazi experiments had not just damaged the barrier between realities, they had attracted the attention of something that existed in the spaces between them. This entity, if it could be called that, seemed to view our reality as a kind of puzzle to be solved, or perhaps a game to be played. It manifested through reflections and duplications, creating copies of people and places that were almost, but not quite, perfect. Each iteration would be slightly different, as if it were testing variations on a theme. The Soviets had documented hundreds of cases of identity displacement, people being replaced by versions of themselves from other realities, often without anyone noticing the substitution. The wall, with its reinforced foundations and embedded technology, was designed to create a kind of quarantine zone, limiting the entity's ability to spread its influence beyond Berlin. But their own research suggested this was at best a temporary solution. The very act of observation seemed to strengthen the phenomenon, as if our attempts to understand it were giving it more power to affect our reality. The truth about the Nazi experiments emerged through a series of discoveries that shattered our understanding of what we were dealing with. In a partially collapsed bunker beneath the Reichstag, we found documentation of Project Spiegelman that went far beyond anything we had imagined. The Nazis hadn't simply been researching occult weapons. They had discovered something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. Their experiments had revealed that what we think of as solid matter was more like a thin film floating on an ocean of possibilities. Through their research, they had learned to create tiny tears in this film, allowing them to access other versions of reality. But in doing so, they had attracted the attention of something that existed in the spaces between these realities. The entity they contacted didn't operate according to any physics or logic we could understand. It seemed to view our reality as a kind of experiment, testing different variations by creating duplicates of people and places with slight alterations. The photographs we found showed test subjects splitting into multiple versions of themselves, each one slightly different, as if reality itself was trying out different possibilities simultaneously. Harrison's analysis of the recovered Nazi equipment revealed a terrifying sophistication that went beyond 1940s technology. The devices they had constructed operated on principles that modern physics couldn't explain, incorporating materials that seemed to change their fundamental properties when observed. More disturbing were the logs of their attempts to communicate with what they had contacted. The entity didn't seem to understand or care about human consciousness. It viewed our entire reality as a kind of laboratory for its experiments. The Nazi scientists had believed they could control these forces, using them to create the perfect soldier by pulling together the best attributes from multiple reality versions. Instead, they had created fractures in the structure of reality itself, fractures that had been slowly widening in the years since the war. The Soviet construction of the Berlin Wall wasn't just about preventing escape. They were trying to contain these fractures before they spread beyond the city. Each section of the wall had been designed to act as a kind of reality anchor, stabilizing the boundaries between different versions of Berlin. But the cost of this containment was becoming increasingly clear in the reports we intercepted. People on both sides of the wall were being affected in ways that defied explanation. Dieter's connection to these events became horrifyingly clear when we discovered his father's personal journals hidden in a lead-lined box in the bunker. The elder Weber had been more than just a researcher in the Nazi program. He had been one of the first to make direct contact with the entity. His experiments had shown that the human mind could be used as a kind of bridge between realities, allowing consciousness to exist simultaneously in multiple versions of the same person. But this process had consequences that went beyond simple duplication. Each copy would retain memories of its other versions, creating a kind of quantum consciousness that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. The implications of this discovery hit me like a physical blow when I realized why Dieter had been checking his reflection so obsessively. He wasn't sure which version of himself he was. His father's experiments hadn't ended with the war. They had continued in secret, passed down from father to son in ways that fractured Dieter's very identity. The patterns he had been drawing around our observation posts weren't just superstitious protection. They were mathematical formulas designed to stabilize his own existence in our particular reality. Our surveillance operation took on a new dimension of horror as we began to understand what we were really observing. The Soviet scientists weren't just studying these phenomena, they were actively trying to weaponize them. Their research had shown that the fractures in reality could be manipulated to create perfect infiltrators, duplicates that could replace their originals without anyone noticing the difference. But they had lost control of the process. The entity they were dealing with had begun creating duplicates on its own, following patterns that seemed random but suggested a deeper experiment in human identity and consciousness. Through our monitoring equipment, we began detecting what Harrison called reality echoes, moments where multiple versions of the same event would play out simultaneously, each one slightly different. The most disturbing aspect was the way these duplicates would sometimes become aware of their own nature. We documented cases of Soviet officers encountering their duplicates, both versions insisting they were the original, both having memories that proved their claim. The philosophical horror of this situation became personal when we realized we had no way of knowing if we ourselves had been duplicated, or worse, if we were the duplicates. The situation reached its breaking point in late October 1961. The wall was nearly complete, but the reality fractures it was meant to contain had grown beyond Soviet control. We had positioned ourselves in an observation post near Checkpoint Charlie, monitoring what we thought was routine Soviet activity, when Harrison's equipment detected something unprecedented. The reading suggested that multiple versions of reality were converging on our location, as if the membrane between possibilities was wearing dangerously thin. Through our surveillance equipment, we observed Soviet research teams frantically working to contain what appeared to be tears in the visible fabric of space. The air itself seemed to ripple like heat waves, showing glimpses of other versions of Berlin layered over our own. Dieter became increasingly agitated, insisting that they were finally making their move. His behavior became more erratic as the phenomenon intensified, until he suddenly stopped in mid-sentence and stared at his reflection in the window. "I remember now," he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance. "I remember all of it, every version, every possibility." Before we could react, he turned to us with eyes that reflected something far older than human consciousness. "They're not containing it," he said, his voice overlapping with other versions of itself. "They're letting it in, and it's already too late." As if to punctuate his words, the mirror on the wall began to ripple, and through its surface, I saw another version of myself watching. But this time, my reflection smiled first. In that moment, as reality itself seemed to fold in on itself, I finally understood why the entity had been creating all these duplicates. It wasn't studying us, it was practicing. And now, 60 years later, as I write this account, I still can't be certain if I'm the one who witnessed these events, or merely a perfect copy implanted with the original's memories. But I do know one thing. When I visit Berlin today and look into the mirrors of my hotel room, sometimes my reflection takes a moment too long to match my movements. And in that brief delay, I see something ancient and patient watching through my own eyes, still running its experiments in the spaces between what was, what is, and what could be.